some aspects of what device drivers look like in the context of Linux, I just wanted to very briefly touch upon the idea of how drivers are handled in other operating systems, right? Because everything we are talking about is with respect to Linux. This whole notion of platform drivers and so on is actually fairly specific to how Linux handles things. In Windows, you might have at some point come across something called an INF file, an information file, right? Which once again does something very similar. What happens is that it declares something called a hardware ID, and there is some plug and play manager which is present, again a piece of code inside the Windows kernel, right? Windows has its own version of the kernel, the core operating system, which handles the actual processing of everything that's happening on the system, right? And in this case, that plug and play manager looks for something similar to the compatibility string so that it can use it in order to match a piece of hardware with an appropriate device driver, right? And various kinds of resources, instead of the /sys file system, there is this notion of the registry, right? And the registry is used in order to actually have different entries which correspond to the drivers that are present, or rather the parameters that can be modified as part of different device drivers, right? There are other RTOS, real-time operating systems. For example, one of them is something called Zephyr, right, which uses something called some notion of static device tables, right, which tries to pretty much build everything, or rather compile everything at build time itself, right. So potentially less flexible than what Linux is. Part of the reason for that being the RTOS is sort of much more focused on one particular system that you are trying to build, right. And as you can imagine, when you are building bare metal systems, you pretty much do not bother with any of this, right, because over there you do not really have an operating system that's going to sort of look for compatibility, load drivers and so on. You have full control over the system, but literally by definition you are trying to compile something that's going to run on bare metal directly on the hardware, right. So every bit of it, including initializing the drivers, is done manually. So just to wrap up, part of what we were looking at over here was how do we go about doing this process of device tree binding, right? We need to have the compatibility strings that are present in the device tree as well as in the platform driver. There are certain APIs that are provided by the Linux kernel which help us to sort of write a driver in such a way that memory management, resource acquiring as well as management as well as freeing are all handled in a very systematic manner. And we can also use this virtual file system /sys in order to have an easy point of access that the end user can get into parameters that belong inside the kernel, right. We also found that we could, for example, if I have large chunks of data that I need to transfer, I could use essentially the same approach, right. Just define a list of addresses and then say, okay, write into one particular virtual file, and the driver can automatically convert that into a set of values that get written into locations. Now in practice, what we'll find is that at the hardware level we probably need to make other changes if we want to get efficient transfer of data, right. And in practice you are almost never going to be having this kind of a system where the kernel is going to be parsing numbers out of ASCII human readable strings, because that's quite inefficient, right. But it's possible and is one of the ways by which we can basically transfer data, at least for testing and debugging. And auto loading of modules, right, is something that once again the kernel can handle through the mod aliases, the module aliases that it identifies basically from the compatibility strings, right, and it sort of creates that all of those entries while compiling the modules themselves, right. And once it has done that, as and when the system actually is booting up, it's possible to just search for all the mod aliases and try and load appropriate drivers for them, and this process can be automated.